All right, we pick up tonight in chapter 1, picking up in verse 11 of chapter 1 of Exodus. And we read these words. Therefore, they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh treasure city, Pithom and Ramesses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they were grieved because of the children of Israel. And the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor. And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage in mortar and brick and in all manner of service in the field. All their service wherein they made them serve was with rigor. You remember the Egyptians are concerned because the Israelites are multiplying. And they're worried because if an enemy would attack, they said, well, if Israel would join with them, it would be, well, they'd just overtake us. And so they decided to afflict them the best they could. They put them into slavery. They set taskmasters over them. Now, so many people say, well, they built the pyramids, but they didn't. The pyramids were already built by this time, most of them anyway. The Israelites built treasure cities. Pharaoh's treasure cities. That's one of the few. If you ever seen the old movie, Cecil B. DeMille, The Ten Commandments, it's not completely biblically accurate, but that's one thing they did get right. They had them building cities, Pithom and Ramesses. Pharaoh means great house, by the way. It's a title, and it's not a proper name. It's kind of like later you get Caesar. Well, Caesar wasn't a name, it was a title. Julius Caesar. Caesar was not his last name. It's just he was the Caesar, the king. Same thing with Pharaoh. He was the king, and maybe they started calling him Pharaoh because he lived in a great house, which of course is normal for the leader of a nation to live in a great house. And the treasure cities not only housed treasure, but also weapons and supplies that were needed in case of an attack. It was kind of like a little fort, I guess. It was a place that was ready. And later you're going to find that David did the same thing in Israel. He had cities where he had weapons stored. Afflicted, that we read here, that Pharaoh afflicted the nation of Israel. At this point, it's still the family of Israel. They haven't become a nation yet, but they're a family, and they're growing rapidly. And so they afflicted them. And this is the same word that God used back in Genesis 15:13. And he said unto Abram, know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. Same word that God had predicted would be used against them, affliction. And that was predicted far before the Egyptian bondage. Not only did the Lord tell Abraham that his descendants would serve with rigor down in Egypt, but they would be there 400 years. Quite a prophecy. This slavery in Egypt was like being in an iron smelting furnace. How do I know? Deuteronomy 4:20. But the Lord hath taken you and brought you forth out of the iron furnace, even out of Egypt. These pictures, these are picture words, and it really shows you what Israel was going through when they were in Egypt. When you think about an iron furnace, if you were, for example, in Pittsburgh where they do all the iron and steel, if you would go in there, it would be hot, and the work is heavy. That's what they were into. They were definitely afflicted. The Israelites were organized into large labor gangs under Egyptian taskmasters. And in spite of the ruthlessness of the Egyptians, they did treat the children of Israel, well, harshly. One thing, what they were trying to do, it seemed to me, is work them to death, trying to eliminate as many as they could, But what does the Bible tell us? God continually prospered them numerically. They continue to grow. Instead of the numbers decreasing, they're increasing. From this family of 70, we're going to find out they're going to be over 2 million in a very short period of time. And this caused greater concern and worry for the Egyptians because this increase was worrisome. This is a big army that's up in Goshen. It's an army that can join in and destroy us. So they increased the workload of Israel. It says, as we're told in verse 14, and they made their lives bitter with hard bondage in mortar and in brick and in all manner of service in the field, and all their service where they were made to serve was with rigor. In other words, they just kept piling it on and on and on in an attempt to, well, not only accomplish what they wanted by building, but to try to destroy their slaves there. So in verse 15, and the king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other was Puah. Now, here we see he's going to try something different. He's going to go to the midwives. Continuing, he says, and the king of Egypt called the midwives and said unto them, why have ye done? Oh, I'm sorry, out of place here. My notes are all messed up, and I'm sorry. He says, when ye do the office of midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them upon their stools, if it be a son, then ye shall kill him. But if it be a daughter, then she shall stay alive. So enslavement wasn't as effective as they thought it would be. The Egyptians had tried to work them to death, so that wasn't working. They were still multiplying. So Pharaoh comes up with another idea. He's going to act a little more aggressively. In this case, it's infanticide. That's what he's up to. He is going to murder the newborn male children. You know, it must not be thought that the Israelites had, by the way, only two midwives. The midwives, those who helped to bear. Most likely, there were a large number. These two women may have been the head of the little organization, for lack of a better term. And with the number of births in Israel, there had to be a good number of midwives. But the king's order, you notice, is explicit. In other words, these two women were to tell all the midwives, if they give birth to a baby boy, he is to be killed. So the king's order is very straightforward. The stools that you saw there in verse 16, when they upon their stools, they were a pair of bricks or stones on which the women crouched in childbirth in those days. I thought I'd mention that so we understand exactly what's being said here. The midwives are really put in a very bad situation, weren't they? These are Hebrew women, and they've been told to commit murder. That's the only way to put it. But the midwives feared God. Now, the word fear here means to respect and honor God. It doesn't mean that they were afraid, knee-knocking fear, but they respected God. And there was fear. They knew if they had disobeyed God that, well, judgment was there. And he did not as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men children alive. And the king of Egypt called the midwives and said unto them, why have ye done this thing, and have saved the men children alive? And the midwives said unto Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are lively, and are delivered ere the midwives come unto them. Okay. I like that last little bit. The midwives give Pharaoh a little shot there. Did you notice it? See, he talks about it. The midwives, fearing God, they were not going to kill these children. They're accepting the law of God. They don't have the law yet, but they're accepting God and what God would have them to do more than the rule of the monarch. Acts 5:29 says, and then Peter and the others apostles answered and said, "We ought to obey God rather than men." This is the same reason the midwives did not obey Pharaoh. They were going to honor God. And they knew that killing those babies was a sin. A word you may not have seen yet, but it's a sin. They knew it was wrong. And so these two midwives were called to answer for their misconduct before Pharaoh. And they answered Pharaoh's question, "Why in the world have you not done what I told you to do? Why are you being disobedient? Basically, you're breaking the law because I told you to do it." But they're pretty quick. They said, these women, these Hebrew women, they deliver their children before we can even get there. They're not like the Egyptian women who were just so dainty and they have to have so much help. You know, it's a shot if you listen to it. These women do the job and go on. They don't need any help from us. So the baby boys are actually hidden. By the time we get there, they've delivered those baby boys and they're hidden, and we don't know if they're boys or girls, or if they had the child, if the child's dead. We don't know. They give birth and we can't kill them if we can't find them. You know, the answer seems kind of illogical, doesn't it? But actually the midwives, fearing God, may have actually responded slowly to the house calls. That's possible too, just to be on the safe side. But what amazes me is evidently the scripture never mentions this, so evidently Pharaoh didn't punish these women. That's surprising, isn't it? Which shows what? God's hand is involved in this. Therefore, God dwelt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and waxed very mighty. And it came to pass, because the midwives feared God, he made them houses. God blessed the Israelites with increased fertility. And he bestowed mercy on these two women, and these midwives. God's purpose in granting the increase seems to really stir the anger of Pharaoh and the fear of the Egyptians. It doesn't seem to them that anything we do stops this growth. You know, the one thing that amazes me, when all this is going on, and they're so afraid of Israel, why don't they just say, leave? We're worried about you. Go home. Go back across the river. Leave us alone. It's never mentioned. It's the same obstinance that you're going to see later when Moses comes back. But they do not even consider letting them go because they need their slaves. They want to build things. So there's another intention now to more severely discomfort God's people. And this does something else. The more that Pharaoh and the Egyptians persecute the people, there's a stronger desire for their deliverance. They are beginning now, with everything that happens, they are looking for the deliverer. Now, everything that happens, more and more, they're looking for someone to lead them out. But there's an immediate blessing for this. There's a larger blessing coming, but there's an immediate blessing. The house that we see here in verse 21 is literally families or households. These women were blessed by God, and they had houses and they had children because of God. God granted these two midwives families because of their obedience to him. God blessed them greatly. And that's what we see here. So there's a situation there. We see now that the Pharaoh really is stopping nothing to destroy them. So as we get into chapter 2, we see the birth. Now the story turns to Moses from this point on. And it's very brief. You know, Moses' life is divided into 3 chapters of 40 years each. 40 years he lived as an Egyptian. 40 years he lived as a shepherd over in Midian. And 40 years he's going to be the leader of Israel. It always amazes me at the age of 80, Moses comes back and leads the nation. I don't care if it's then or now. 80, it's not a young fellow anymore. So this chapter, we begin to see Moses as a deliverer. He has the story turns now to him. Remember, Exodus is the book of redemption. But nothing is begun and nothing ends in Exodus. It just continues the story of Genesis. And it just precedes Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. It gives us a great story. Now, let's look at the birth of Moses. Now, these things, you remember back in Sunday school when you guys were growing up, how many years did you study about Moses? Moses' birth and that little basket. I can remember being a little fellow talking about Moses. This is not something you haven't heard before. And there went a man of the house of Levi and took to wife a daughter of Levi. And the woman conceived and bare a son. And when she saw him that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. That's a quick story, isn't it? It's a story of a man and woman seem to fall in love. They get married. They have a child. All this is happening. You notice that even the names of the parents aren't given. We'll get it later, but not told here. And Moses is writing this account now. Moses is the author. And he's writing about his parents and his own birth. But it's a modest record, isn't it? Not much he doesn't say too much about anything. He just gets to the point. That's why we have to turn to other portions of the Bible to give us more information about the events that happen here in Exodus. If given the opportunity, I think most of us would want to tell about our parents in more detail. We would talk about, you give your father's name, your mother's name, I always like to tell people, here it is, 2021, my dad was born in 1899, over a century ago. And that's something I like to talk about. Moses doesn't mention that at all. He just gives us very little information. Basically, they were just ordinary people. They were ordinary people living in slavery. They were members, though we do find out one thing, members of the tribe of Levi. And this is important. This information that's given us in verse 1 comes to play later because the priestly line from Levi, from Aaron. And this is all that Moses says at this point. He had a mom and a dad. They're from the tribe of Levi, and they had a son. He was a goodly son, and they hid him. Later on, we find out that Amram and Yoshabel were the name of the father and mother. And verse 2 only tells us that Moses was a good child, a healthy child. The child of Moses was fine. That is, he's beautiful, he's healthy, God has chosen him to do something. Stephen said Moses was no ordinary child in Acts 7:20. So did the writer of Hebrews over in Hebrews 11:23. No ordinary child. God had already chosen him before birth to do a great thing. And so, acting by faith in God's ability to solve the problems, Moses' parents hid the boy for 3 months. But after 3 months, it wasn't safe to keep him there any longer. Why wouldn't it be safe after 3 months? If you made it 3 months, wouldn't you think that he could possibly make it longer? Moses doesn't really seem like he wants to give much of his own record in any detail. But there's some reasons why they couldn't hide him any longer. Verse 3. And when she could no longer hide him, she took him an ark of bulrushes and dabbed it with slime and with pitch and put the child therein, and she laid it in the flags by the river's brink. At 3 months, Moses' crying is probably stronger. They couldn't keep him hid. She was afraid for the child, afraid that he would be found out and put to death. Well, this is not going to happen. He's not going to be cast in the river to drown. He was a healthy child and he had a good set of lungs. His parents could hide him at first, but the day came when Moses could really scream at the top of his voice, and the neighbors or people passing on the street or Pharaoh, one of the Egyptian soldiers, could hear, and they would come in to find out about it. It's interesting, but they want to keep Moses quiet. But it's later when the Lord asks Moses to return to lead his people out of Egypt. Moses, I can't speak. I'm slow of tongue. But yet that's one of the reasons that his mother wanted to protect him, because now evidently he was very loud. But later he's making excuses, as we all do. Many of us we're good at crying like babies, but as adults, we don't do so well for the Lord. We can whine and cry about things when we should be speaking out for the Lord. So Yoshebel had a problem. She couldn't hide the child any longer. She loves the child. She wants the child. There are a lot of pious people who would have said they would have acted differently from this mother. They're going to say, well, we would just trust the Lord. That's exactly what she's doing, folks. Yoshebel is trusting the Lord. And when you say you need to trust the Lord, that's a wonderful statement. But do you really trust the Lord, or are you playing a fool? That's the question for you. Yoshebel would have been foolish to keep the child in the house when a guard could have walked by and heard him crying. It would have meant instant death for Moses. I hear somebody saying, well, the child wouldn't cry when a guard passed by. You keep him quiet. How are you going to keep a child quiet? You ever try to keep one quiet for a minute? You can't do it. Faith is not a leap in the dark. I've heard some liberals say that some years ago. Faith is just a leap in the dark. No, it's not. God asks us to believe that which is good, that which is solid. And God never asks us to do foolish things. Yoshebel is doing the sensible thing. She made a little ark for Moses. She put pitch on it and she puts him out there. Now you have to have a lot of faith in God. There are a lot of things out there in the Nile. What if the ark would leak? What if an Egyptian guard looked down, picked it up, found the baby? What if a hungry Nile crocodile would come by? God's in control. And you can see it right here. Verse 4 says, and his sister stood afar off to wit what would be done to him. This too is very brave, to send his sister to walk along the banks there and to watch the little basket go down the river. She's in danger too. Have you ever thought about that? A crocodile's pretty quick on land, and there are a lot of Nile crocodiles. You don't know what's out there, but she's following and she's watching. She's watched there as Moses is going down the river. She wanted to see what's going to happen to her baby brother. Her actions, though, indicate that even this young girl is trusting God. And the daughter of Pharaoh came out to wash herself at the river, and her maidens walked along by the riverside. And when she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maid to fetch it. This is so much like Esther right here, because you see the hand of the Lord, right, working through this whole story. The Lord is intervening in this situation in a mighty way. This is what the Lord does when you use common sense. And Yoshebel demonstrated sensibility. She's sensible in this. Pharaoh's daughter came down to the Nile to wash. That's where you would go. It was undoubtedly a very secluded area. And there was the ark. It didn't come there by happenstance. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't luck. God put that ark in that spot at that time for a purpose. And so she sees it. She sends one of her attendants out to get that ark. And when she had opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the babe wept. And she had compassion on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Did you notice here again, God's hand? She opens the basket and Moses starts to cry. It's almost as if the Lord reached down into that basket and pinched him so that he would cry at that very moment, and it just softens her heart. The Bible says she has compassion on him. Wow. You see, God brought two things together right there: a baby's cry and a woman's heart. Pharaoh's daughter just couldn't pass up this little baby boy. She knows he's a Hebrew, and she doesn't care. Then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call thee a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for thee?" I'll tell you what, Miriam is pretty bold, isn't she? She comes up to one of the royalty of Egypt. And could I go get a nurse? Oh, I know a Hebrew woman who could nurse the child for you. It's a very helpful suggestion for the princess. Later on, she's going to never let her younger brother forget it. We'll find out about that too, but it's a very human story right here that we're reading. God has something to tell us on every page of his book. And I really like verse 8. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." And the maid went and called the child's mother. Tell me that God is not in control. This is a real turn of events. It shows God is moving in a mighty way. When we act sensibly and we move by faith, God moves. The very mother of the child, Yoshebel, is called, and what's she going to do? She is going to nurse the child. She's going to raise him for a while, and she's going to get paid for it. Tell me that God is not in control. You can't beat that. You can't beat when God is moving in hearts and in lives. And Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, "Take the child away and nurse it for me, and I will give thee wages." And the woman took the child and nursed it. And the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses, and she said, "Because I drew him out of the water." The name Moses means drawer out. And Pharaoh's daughter named him that because she drew him out of the water. It just amazes me. Here Yoshebel gets to keep her child close to her for a little bit longer. And she knows he is going to be safe. He's going to be raised in the house of Pharaoh. He is not going to have to go out into the work in the fields or build cities. He is going to have a better life. We don't know exactly who this woman was, whether it's Pharaoh's sister, Pharaoh's daughter, the oldest daughter of Ramesses II. We don't know for sure. But she's a member of the family. And according to the Egyptian customs of that day, her firstborn son still had the right to the throne. Moses would have been in line. How about that? Think about this. He was in line for the throne of Egypt had Ramesses II and his queen not had children. He would have been the next one to sit on the throne of Egypt. God is in control. I'm going to have to stop there. Good place. It's a change of thought. And we'll, Lord willing, pick it up again next week.